Go ahead and get started. We want to continue our discussion on the Boeing B-17 external features. And we're going to use this view, which is the starboard quarter front view. And what we'll do is we'll start at the far left and work our way around to this top part. So let's start with the wing leading edge. And we notice that we see three, we call these Ram Air Scoops. So recall that the cruise altitude of the B-17 is anywhere from 24,000 to 30,000 feet, and its true airspeed is about 240 miles an hour, which is, indicated airspeed of about 150 miles an hour. So the air is going to enter these cavities at, minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, reduced pressure, reduced density, at about 240 miles an hour. So this first cavity, this first ram air scoop, is going to take the air, run it through multiple systems to help supplement the engine's performance. So it's going to run through a turbocharger, it's going to run through an intercooler, it's going to run through the carburetor, and it's going to run through a supercharger. Then it's going to make its way past the cylinder valves into the cylinder itself. So that's the function of this particular inlet. The inboard inlet is called the Intercooler Ram Air Scoop. So as we heat up the air with the turbocharger and the turbocharger systems down here, that's the exhaust pipe or tailpipe for the from the collector ring of the engine. As we heat up the air, as we compress the air with the turbocharger, it heats up as a byproduct because we're putting mechanical work into it. So what we want to do is cool that air as it makes its way to the engine. And the way we cool it is we use the intercooler. So think of the intercooler as like an air radiator. This air is not mixing with the air that's going to make its way to the engine, but it's there to cool the air. So if we move ourselves inboard, we see the wing leading edge anti-icing boots. So this is actually a rubber fabric that is draped over the leading edge, and the pilot has the ability to essentially blow compressed air in here. It will expand, and what we want to do is break off any ice that may have formed on the leading edge of the wing. So that's a function of this guy. Now this airplane's 87 years old, and this rubber piece does not last that long. So they just paint most of the 50 or so B-17s on display. They'll just have black paint to represent the anti-icing system of the leading edge of the wing. If we move farther inboard, we have an oil cooler. These engines generate a lot of heat. We have cooling fins on our cylinders. We also have cowl flaps that we talked about in another video. But the oil system helps dissipate the heat of the engine. So that oil is going to be put through this little radiator that's going to cool the oil in the engine. So each engine has 3 of these ram air scoops. This is the exhaust pipe for engine number 3. Now engine number 2, it's down here, but they had to reroute it. This is your collector ring where all the exhaust comes in. They had to reroute it because this is the main gear wheel well. So you could poke your head up in here and you'd see a 37-gallon oil tank, and the landing gear just articulates into this cavity. This airplane's on a 10-degree slope, by the way, while it's on the ground. You got a tail wheel back here, which is one of the other part of the gear system. It's not steerable. If we move ourselves inboard, we see a little itty-bitty circle, and that's an instrument that the navigator uses called the drift meter. It's a D5 drift meter. It's closed right now, but what you would see in usage is you'd see a little periscope sticking out about 3 inches, and that periscope is pointed straight down. So the pilot can use this drift meter, this instrument, to determine ground speed. So he would look at an object on the ground and essentially track it with a stylus, and then based on the time duration, you have a little stopwatch, he can determine what the true ground speed is. And he could also use that instrument to determine the drift. So if you have a crosswind affecting this airplane, he could determine the drift and then provide that information to the pilot co-pilot so they could correct for that, so you can maintain course. If we move farther inboard, we see device sticking out, and that's the Pitot Tube. So think of so we call these ram air scoops. Think of the Pitot Tube as a mini ram air scoop. It's measuring what we call the stagnation pressure of the air. So it's a free stream measurement. So we want the instrument, there'll be an opened up cavity here where the air can go right into, and they want this to not be affected by the influence of the fuselage of the airplane. So it's located kind of farther away from the fuselage. In conjunction with this is a static port, and there's static ports on this airplane. So if you take the pressure differential from the Pitot Tube and the static port, that's the information the pilot's going to use to determine the indicated airspeed. He also can use that information to determine what they call the pressure altitude. So if we move forward, we can see the aerial directional finder antenna that we mentioned in another video. That's one of the 4 ways the navigator could use to determine the position of the airplane relative to the Earth and determine how to get back to base. So generally in Great Britain, they would send out a radio beam, and the antenna in here, it's a loop antenna, they would just follow essentially the strongest signal. If we move forward, we can see the plexiglass nose where our bombardier would sit. This is the Norton bomb sight. That's his Browning M250 caliber machine gun. We saw in another video the navigator's machine gun, which is inset a little farther back. Now, this is the F model. The G model actually they relocated this ADF antenna farther aft, and they put in and bolted on a Bendix twin 50 caliber machine gun turret. It's tapped into the hydraulic system, and the fire control unit for this turret, the 2 forward-facing guns, would be operated by the bombardier. Obviously, his primary responsibility is to drop the ordnance, but he's also a gunner. Pretty much all the other crew members are gunners except for the pilot, co-pilot. If we move farther aft, we can see the top of the celestial dome. That's another navigation method. So the navigator could pull out an instrument called a sextant, put his head in here, take the position of sun or stars at 2 different times, use charts and determine where they are. And as I mentioned in the previous video, they're within about 25-mile radii of your actual location. Flight deck windscreen is armored, mentioned that in another video. Top turret gunner, also the flight engineer. So we move farther back, we look at the radial engines. Radial engine means that the 9 cylinders all spider out from a central hub. We have a whole video on the engine system and the cowl flaps of the B-17. And the propellers. So we have the ability to fully feather these propellers, and we have the ability to rotate them in flight so they can bite into the wind more or less to increase the efficiency of the engines and maximize the thrust with minimum fuel burn on each one of these engines. Okay, so if you have any questions on this diagram or any other topics you would like to see pursued in greater detail, just please let me know in the comment section, and I will hopefully oblige.